This week we're going to talk about the Greek Golden Age. This is an era that continues to be very influential on our own modern time period. And so it shouldn't surprise you that we're going to dedicate a whole week to this rather short time span. Now, historians kind of differ over where specifically to delineate the Greek Golden Age. Some historians will mark it a little bit earlier, around the mid-6th century, but for the purposes of this course, we're going to talk about the Greek Golden Age as being the 5th century B.C.E. And so we're going to start with Greek victory over the Persians, and then we're going to end this period. Typically, historians agree on when the Greek Golden Age ended, and that is with the Peloponnesian War in the last third of the 5th century. This was a devastating conflict that brought in much of the Greek world and contributed to serious decline in Greek society and culture. So let's begin this lecture with a discussion of the Ionian city-states, because this is a pivotal moment in history, and so let's get some good context here. Now, in 507 BCE, Athens feared an attack from its rival Sparta, and so it sent ambassadors to Persia to ask for help. They were seeking an alliance with Persia against their rivals Sparta. The Athenian ambassadors agreed to the Persian terms for an alliance, which included an acknowledgement of Athenian submission to the Persian king. Now think about this. The ambassadors agreed that Athens would submit to Persian demands. And this did not go over well back in Athens. The Athenian assembly was outraged at the idea of submitting Athens to Persian authority. But they never actually informed the Persian king Darius that they rejected his terms. So in 499 BCE, Greek city-states in Ionia revolted against what they felt was unjust Persian-installed tyrants in that part of the Persian Empire. They really disliked the government figures who had been put in control of the region by the Persian Empire. And Athenians supported the rebellions. So Darius, as a result of this really complicated and really confusing situation, believed that Athens had submitted to his authority, and when Athens actually supported this rebellion against his authority, supported the Ionians against his authority, he felt betrayed and he was furious. Because, again, he believed that Athens had submitted themselves to his rule as a result of his support of them in their conflict with Sparta. In 490 BCE, Darius sent a small fleet to punish and take control of Athens. The Athenian hoplites defeated the more lightly armored Persians at the Battle of Marathon and forced them to retreat. And this might be a familiar story to you. The Battle of Marathon, there's a myth, and you'll find that there's some disagreement over whether the story of the Battle of Marathon is actually accurate. But in general, this is the story where a runner takes a message to the Greeks after having run this long distance to do so, and collapses at the end and dies. Now, in reality, some scholars believe that he didn't actually die. Some scholars believe that the message was different from what the story says, but those are details, I suppose. And what you should take away from this is that this is sort of where we get our tradition of running marathons from. This is what has inspired these marathons that happen all over our country and all over the Western world. Now, after forcing the Persians to retreat as a result of the victory at Marathon, the Athenians took a lot of pride in this victory, and it was a time period of what we might relate to as a lot of patriotism. Greeks were very excited about this, and this helped inform their identity, and they took a lot of pride in this event. The Marathon victory actually strengthened Athens. It really boosted its own sense of itself. And following this, there also happened to be a great silver strike in 483 BCE in some publicly owned mines that belonged to Athens. Now, so between the victory at Marathon and this great silver strike that brought a lot of wealth into Athens, this meant that there was that the Athenians now had the resources to build what would become essentially an empire. And this is where we start seeing the rise of the leader Themistocles. He urged the assembly to actually double the size of their navy to better defend the city. He really believed that it wasn't going to be land forces that strengthened Athens, but it would be a navy. And he actually turned out to be right. And so I encourage you to watch the documentary that I've put in Blackboard, because it gives you a really good view of the effect of Themistocles and his reforms and the building of this navy. And how that really helped Athens to build an empire, even though we traditionally don't really think of it as an empire, but essentially it did become an empire. Okay, so Darius had a son named Xerxes I, and the Persians did not easily forget what had occurred between them and Athens. So Xerxes I assembled an enormous army around 480 BCE in order to invade Greece and add the mainland city-states to the many lands that were paying him taxes. In response, 31 Greek city-states actually united as allies to defend their political freedom, and this would be one of the few times in the history of ancient Greece that we will see so many of the Greek city-states unite together for a common cause. But the one thing they could agree on is that they didn't want to be subject to the Persians, and so this brought them together. The allied states formed what is called the Hellenic League, and they were led by Sparta at a place called Thermopylae, and this might be familiar to you if you've watched a particular movie. At a place called Thermopylae in 480 BCE, a small force of Greeks, led by the Spartans, fought the Persians to the death. And the Persian invaders, in turn, defeated the Spartans, forced an evacuation of Athens, and burned the city. And this was a devastating episode for the Athenians to watch their city burned. But as we're going to see, the Athenians are going to follow this up with a building program that is quite stunning and amazing. So Themistocles had a political rival named Aristides, and both of these men came together and convinced the Greek members of the League to fight a naval battle. Remember, Themistocles had already convinced Athens that the way to defend themselves was to develop a superior naval force. So now they're going to use this naval force. And so at a place called Salamis, the Greek fleet destroyed a larger Persian fleet. It's a typical underdog story, and they do this through using the geography that was available to them to exploit the weaknesses of the Persian fleet. The Persian fleet was large and bulky, while the Greek ships were a little bit more maneuverable, and they were also very strong, with strong hulls. And so they essentially rammed the fleet. And there are stories that say that the Straits of Salamis ran red with blood as a result of this battle. There was so much devastation to the Persian fleet, a lot of death. And this battle at Salamis led Xerxes to retreat in 479 BCE. Sparta and its Greek allies destroyed what remained of the Persian army as it retreated. And so this was a large blow to the Persian Empire, and it would take some time for it to recover. Greek military superiority derived from excellent leadership and heavily armored and well-equipped troops. In fact, Themistocles became he became incredibly popular as a result of this battle, and became a great leader for a while, until as you'll read in your text, he's eventually seen as so popular that the Athenians decide that his popularity is a threat to their democracy, and they exile him. So this kind of gives you a view of the area that we're talking about when it comes to the war with Persia. You can see from the map some of the battles that are taking place, and so where they have taken place. If you look in what on my screen looks like a mauve color, the Greek states allied against Persia, it marks those Greek states. Right in the middle of it, you'll have some water that cuts through it, and you'll see Salamis, and this is where this significant naval battle took place that turned the tide for Greece. Okay, so after working together to defeat the Persians, both Athens and Sparta formed separate alliances to strengthen their positions against each other. Just because they united for this one common cause does not mean that it changed the way that they viewed one another. They still saw each other as rivals, they still saw each other as threats, and so in order to deal with this threat from the other, they formed alliances with other Greek city-states. The Spartans, with their superior infantry, remember they were well known for their land army with their infantry, and they formed the Peloponnesian League with land forces from that region and the sizable Corinthian navy. And so the Athenians, in response, with their superior navy, allied with the northern city-states, the Aegean Islands, as well as the Ionian coast, to establish what we call the Delian League. City-states paid dues based on their individual wealth, and originally this was supposed to be a democratic alliance for collective security, but at its height the Delian League involved over 300 cities, and it became less and less democratic. In fact, it's going to be the source of Athens' imperial power. So the Delian League was really rooted in Athens' naval power. This was what made it strong. And its city-states paid for the League's warships. So increasingly, city-states other than Athens elected to pay dues rather than provide the required ships. They were expensive to build, and some of these city-states didn't have the same resources as Athens. Remember, Athens has a lot of money, a lot of wealth from its rich silver mines, and most city-states didn't have that level of wealth, and so they opted just to pay dues and let Athens take the responsibility for building ships. So as a result of this, the Athenian fleet grew because of all of these revenues coming in from the League, and Athenians used that fleet to force states to pay their dues and to dominate the League. So it's looking less and less like an alliance and more like an empire. Athens became prosperous from spoils and cash dues from the League. Officers used these spoils to advance their own political careers, in fact. In this way, the Delian League, originally a democratic alliance for collective security, like I said, is becoming more of an empire. So this is just a map that shows the different alliances and where they were situated, and you can see that the Delian League covers a lot of shoreline. So we shouldn't be surprised that it emphasized a strong navy versus Sparta, whose allies tended to be, much less along shorelines, but much more land-based. So in the 460s and 450s BCE, Athenians developed a radical democracy that offered direct political power and participation in the court system to all male citizens. Women could be citizens, but they did not have political rights. And they did not have political power. They had They had no say in the political system at all. Radical democracy sought to involve as many male citizens as possible in direct democracy, and also to place and keep certain elite citizens in leadership roles. This is very different from what we think of as democracy. We tend to think of our own system as a democracy, and in reality, it does not share a lot of the traits that the Athenian direct democracy did. It's quite a different system. In the United States, we have more of a representational system. It's more of a federal system, or you might see it called a republic. But it is a representative system. But in Athens, they were very committed to this idea that that male citizens would have a direct voice in their government, and they accomplished this in a variety of ways. Athenian voters established term limits. They shared power, and they established salaries for most officials. Corruption was punished. It was not something that was tolerated, and citizens enjoyed equal legal protections, while jurors were randomly selected and paid. And notice that I'm talking about citizens, because if you were not a citizen, these rules did not apply. High officials were elected annually, and top officials were unpaid and could be re-elected. Judicial reforms made the legal system even more democratic, as majority votes among jurors decided cases. And oftentimes what you'll see happening, and you'll see this in the video for this week, in the documentary for this week, what you'll see happening is that the Athenians are so committed to this idea of direct democracy that they actually establish a lottery. And so if you were chosen by lottery to serve in a particular capacity, you would do so for a set amount of time, and then you would no longer serve in that capacity once your term was up. And the term was rather short by our standards. It could be just a few months or even just some weeks. But any person, regardless of class, who, as long as they were a citizen and they were male, could serve in any of these capacities if they were drawn by lottery. So that's a really interesting idea. Now, I mentioned that Themistocles, because he became so popular, was exiled from Athens because he was seen as a danger as a result of his popularity. Athenians did not want to risk having a tyranny, and so what this was called in their system was ostracism. Ostracism allowed citizens to exile one man annually for 10 years, and they actually voted on this. Popular men who citizens feared might become tyrants were often ostracized, like Themistocles. Themistocles was ostracized despite a reputation for justice and fair-mindedness. That's really interesting. But ostracism and other aspects of radical democracy led some social elites to criticize the system as likely to promote the interests of the wicked. This was a criticism that they lobbed against ostracism. Some argued that oligarchy was morally superior to radical democracy, and ostracism was one of the features of direct democracy that they pointed to as evidence that this was an inferior system, and oligarchy was a more desirable system. Now, in the golden age of Athens, there rose to prominence a man named Pericles, and he is typically the leader that people think of when they think of classical Greece because of his influence. Pericles' political career in the 450s focused on extending equality. He instituted more and more democratic reforms, and he used his speaking skills to encourage the assembly to pass these radical democratic reforms. So he got these reforms through by convincing people. It was an important ideal in Greek society that you could be a persuasive speaker. That's how you got things done. If you were a political leader, you convinced and persuaded people to do them, to vote for them. And some of these reforms included payment of officials and reforms of the court system. Pericles also fought to restrict citizenship to those born of Athenian parents. And one of the reasons that he was doing this is that Athens was becoming so wealthy that they were having larger and larger numbers of non-Athenians living in Athens. And so some feared that the idea of Athenian citizenship was being watered down, because prior to Pericles' reforms, you only really needed to have one parent who was a citizen of Athens. And so it started it started to feel like there was what you might call a foreign influence coming into Athens that many feared. They just were fearful of. So this was an attempt to deal with that, to ensure that citizenship stayed within Athenian families and was not extended to non-Athenians. And of course, remember that citizenship, you could be Athenian but not a citizen. So it was a very kind of exclusive club to belong to. So one of the ways that he did this was that one of the ways that he strengthened this notion of citizenship, again, was to say that both parents needed to be citizens. One of the effects of this is that it actually strengthened the social position of native-born women. Prior to this, I've already mentioned that Athenian women, even if you were a citizen, had no political say. You didn't have political rights, and so you were quite limited to the household if you were a woman, regardless of whether you were an Athenian citizen or not. But as a result of this reform of Pericles, Athenian women who were native-born enjoyed higher status within society. Now, war broke out with Sparta in the 450s over Athenian conflict with the Peloponnesian League. Pericles supported attacks on Persia and the Peloponnesian League. A defeat at the hands of the Persians in Egypt led Pericles to make peace with Sparta in 446 to 445 B.C.E. And part of what's going on here is that it's this rivalry between Athens and Sparta is bleeding out into their alliances with other city-states. Okay, so this is just a diagram of a trireme. This is the what would be considered new technology for the Greeks. This is the ship that Themistocles was so adamant to develop, because he believed that it would strengthen Athenian defense. And you can see that it requires quite a few people to operate one of these. They were very much dependent on oars. They did have sails, but their speed and their maneuverability came from the people operating the oars. And so this was a system in which everyone had to work together, and came to symbolize the ideal of democracy. Now, by the mid-5th century B.C.E., Athens had accumulated great wealth through trade and plunder. So, it started with this silver mine strike, but as a result of their navy, they're able to trade across the Mediterranean and further build their wealth. But they also were plundering. They were invading other areas and benefiting from that. Public buildings, art, and festivals all expanded as a result. In fact, Pericles was really adamant that Athens itself be beautified. Stoas were built as shelters in market areas, and this offered wealthy patrons the opportunity to display wealth and civic mindedness, because if you had a lot of money, one of the things you would do is you would sponsor a public building project. In the 440s and 430s, on the rocky hill of the Acropolis in Athens, Pericles built the Parthenon, and I'm sure you would recognize the Parthenon. It's a famous building even still today. And it was built as an enormous marble temple to Athena, who was the patron goddess of Athens. A 40-foot-high gold and ivory statue of Athena was inside the massive temple, and the temple itself measured 230 feet long and 100 feet wide. This was a massive structure. The Parthenon's massive style proclaimed self-confidence and an ambition to use human skill to improve nature. Pericles was making a statement with the Parthenon about Athenian ideals and about Athenian dominance of the region. The temple symbolized the goodwill of the gods and portrayed Athena as the city's benefactor. Sculpted panels displayed Athenian victories, and a striking, brightly colored frieze that ran around the top of the walls likely portrayed Athenian men, women, and children on parade in the presence of the gods. Oftentimes when we see these temples, which are now largely ruins today, but when we look at these temples, they're marble and they are all in color, but the Greeks themselves enjoyed painting these buildings. They were richly decorated, highly colored. The Parthenon reflected Athenian confidence and gratitude toward the gods. One of the reasons they built it was to acknowledge the gods and their favor of Athens. So they were attributing their successes to the gods with the Parthenon. So when you take a look at the Parthenon, what I want you to think about is how this expresses classical Greek characteristics. So to the Greeks, the idea of balance in architecture and society is indicated in the design of these structures. The greatness of the Greek civilization is seen in the size and scope of the temples, as is the importance of religion. In fact, this idea of balance to the Athenians was so important that they even developed this way of building to correct sort of the way that your eye would see it. So if everything were perfectly lined up and squared off, your eye would perceive it as rounded, but they would actually round these buildings, the actual structure and the way that the columns were lined up. They would put them on a slight round to accommodate for the way that your eye would perceive these buildings, so that when you looked at it, it would seem massive, it would seem square, and you wouldn't have this problem with perception skewing that view. Now, why do you think later leaders such as Egyptian pharaohs and Roman emperors have worked to preserve the Acropolis? What's its importance? Why bother? A lot historians have really discussed this quite a lot. It's debated quite a lot, but essentially what you might think about is that such leaders would have wanted to be associated with the Acropolis. Remember, this is the golden age of Greece, and its influence throughout the Western world cannot be underemphasized. And so if you wanted to proclaim your own power, one of the ways that you did that was by associating yourself with the Acropolis, with things that spoke of Greekness. Romans are really going to take this to the next level, and they essentially adopt a lot of Greek culture, a lot of Greek symbols, Greek religion, Greek philosophy, and they're going to make it uniquely Roman. But even though they really kind of despised Greeks themselves, they felt that the culture itself had a lot to contribute. And so in doing so, they hoped to associate themselves with that greatness. Now, it's important to remember that the Acropolis became the enduring symbol of Athenian democracy and the greatness of that civilization. And so through this association, leaders and countries could legitimize their own reigns. Okay, and you're going to see this quite a lot in future chapters. So this is just a map of the layout of the city of Athens, because you'll notice that the city itself is not actually sitting on the water. It's off the coastline a bit. At the location of it, there was actually a very good harbor there, but the city lay away from it. And so the solution for this, for the Athenians, was to build these two long walls through which the Athenians could travel from the harbor to the city itself. This was defensive, and it was seen as a way of ensuring that Athens itself could never be burned again, could never be put under siege again, because it would always have ties to the harbor and ties to trade, and they would always have a source of supplies. So that was the idea behind it. And this will give you an idea of some of the architectural developments of Athens. You can see the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian styles of architecture, and it's much more than columns. These were very much based on ratios of height to width to length to diameter. All of this came into play, and so we shouldn't be surprised that geometry was so important to the Greeks, because it really helped to drive their architectural styles. And a lot of civilizations have adopted these various styles of architecture within their own architecture. In fact, if you look around the United States at some of our most important government buildings, many of them harken back to the Greeks. And you'll see elements of that Greek architecture even in our own United States Capitol. And so you'll notice they're very different. The Doric is very plain, it's very masculine. The Ionic column was considered a more feminine style of architecture, and of course the Corinthian had its own distinct column with these acanthus leaves at the top of it, and again, it very much depended on the statement that you were trying to make, the purpose of the structure. Some later on, we're going to see that some architects are going to combine some of these columns together in different ways for different purposes in one structure. It's really kind of interesting how Western civilization has taken these different architectural styles developed in Greece and modified them and used them to present certain ideals and images. Now, tensions emerged over the desire for innovation and pressures to preserve traditional ways. The Greeks really emphasized adherence to traditional ways, and so as it's going through the Golden Age and there's more and more innovation, this is troubling to a lot of Greeks. They're having a hard time with this. Public participation in sacrifices and festivals and involvement in cultic practices, including animal sacrifice, were expected of Greeks. Such activities, along with frequent festivals, reaffirmed community ties to the divine world. It was seen as essential to stability and prosperity in their community. Laborers received days off for religious ceremonies, and many festivals were for women only, interestingly enough. Privately, individuals worked to affirm their own relations with the gods, and families marked significant events with prayers, rituals, and sacrifices. Homes often had their own shrines to maybe a particular patron god. Now, hero cults and mystery cults were part of how Greeks affirmed their relationship with the divine. Mystery cults used prayers, hymns, rituals, and sacrifices to initiate members into secret knowledge of the gods. And often this happened along certain steps. You would complete certain steps to be given the next level of secret knowledge. The Athenian mystery cult of Demeter, for example, was especially popular and attracted worshippers from all over the world. Initiation took place over weeks and offered adherents the promise of a better fate on earth and after death. So we know from these mystery cults, from some of these mystery cults, that Greeks believed in an afterlife. Mystery cults reveal also that ancient Greeks believed their gods required action from their worshippers in order to receive blessings. So the gods to the Greeks, the Greeks believed that the gods took an active interest in what was going on with the Greeks. And so if the Greeks were behaving appropriately and doing, making the necessary sacrifices and so on and so forth, then the Greek gods would reward them for that. And if they weren't doing that, then the consequences could be dire. So as you can see, this is quite different from what you've learned about the Mesopotamians, who believed that the gods had very little interest in what was going on with human beings, and so life was a little bit precarious. Preserving religious tradition was really important to the Greeks because the people saw it as a safeguard against the precariousness of life. Bearing children earned women's status in Greek society. Families were at the heart of Greek society, and so if you were a woman and you were unable to bear children, that could be detrimental to your status in Greek society. Athenian wives were also expected to partner in managing family resources. Property was passed down to children and kept in the family through male heirs. Married daughters became part of their husband's family. Laws protected a woman's dowry, however, and it allowed her to inherit land. But if a man's only heir was a daughter, the law required his closest male relative to marry her and produce sons so that her inheritance would go to a male heir and remain in the family. Women's public behavior was restricted out of concern for sexual morality and to ensure the legitimacy of children. Elite women worked at home and directed the household, only leaving the house for appropriate reasons, and they often did so chaperoned. Poor women worked outside the home, often selling goods at small stalls. So we see that it very much depended on your status, how mobile you were outside of your home. Again, elite women would have been restricted, and if they were able to go out, they would have had to go out with some kind of chaperone, usually a male relative. Pressure on women to bear children was really intense. Bearing children, especially male children, increased women's status because sons could represent their parents in court. The sons were expected to support them in their old age and protect them in a city with no regular police force. So you can see why Greeks privileged sons, because they for Greek parents, this was their security, their retirement and their security. This meant that they would be cared for in their old age. Now, we do have some exceptions, what the Greeks called heteras, or companions. They escaped traditional restrictions on unmarried women. Typically, they were well educated. These companions conversed freely with Athenian men at symposia. They sometimes sold sexual favors at a high price. They were skilled companions. The more skilled you were, the more you attracted admirers and lived a life of luxury. Great riches also freed some women from tradition, and very wealthy women could also be outspoken in public. And so we do see some changes in the status of women and what they're able to do. Traditional social and legal restrictions kept slaves and metics as outsiders in Athenian society. Commercial growth increased the demand for slaves, who could be owned by individuals or they could be owned by the state. In Pericles' time, slaves numbered about 2/5 of the total population, and I want you to think about that, the impact that might have on a civilization, to have such a large proportion of their population be slaves. It shouldn't surprise you that many Greeks worried, and not just in Athens, because it was very common for there to be a large proportion of slaves in many of these Greek city-states. Sparta, in particular, had an especially large population of slaves. But having so many slaves we shouldn't be surprised that for many Greeks, this gave them a sense of sort of precariousness about their own society and its stability. The slaves were a constant source of worry. Rebellion was a constant source of worry. Now, slaves did a range of work in households on farms, in shops, in the navy, and in Athens mines. Metics were foreigners who were granted permanent residence status in return for paying taxes and serving in the military, and they actually constituted up to half the free population. So think about that. We've got 2/5 of the total population as slaves, so that leaves 3/5 of the population as free people. Half of that 3/5 were foreigners who were granted permanent residence status. And so you can see, if you further break that number down and do the math, when you take out women who could not vote, and when you take out children who could not vote, that the number of citizens with legal and political rights in Athens was actually a very small proportion of the population. Now, Metics contributed greatly to the city's prosperity, but they had an inferior social and legal status and were denied official citizenship. And so I talked a little bit earlier about how some of Pericles' reforms involved requiring an individual to have 2 parents who were citizens in order to be considered a citizen themselves. And one of the reasons for this is to make sure that Metics continue to have lower status in Athenian society. So one of the things that we have, one of the sources of information that we have about Greek society are these beautiful vases, this beautiful pottery from Greece. This is red pottery. And it tells us what's really interesting about the Greeks is that they while they would often paint scenes about gods and goddesses from their religion, from stories, they often had these very supernatural scenes portrayed on their vases. They were not afraid to put daily household scenes on their pottery as well. They weren't afraid to put scenes from the trades on their pottery. And so we get these really beautiful works of art that tell us a lot about how society functioned, about how social status worked, about how women's status worked, about how families worked. So they're very informative. Now, I want you to take a look at this particular piece, and I want you to think about how might this woman in the painting, she would be the woman is in the middle of this piece. How do we know that she was perceived as rather an impotent figure? So something that you might notice is that she's actually the smallest figure on the vase. Her husband is with her, and he appears to be involved in the transaction that's going on here. Although this could be taken as a sign of her higher social status as well. Historians kind of differ over this. But how do we know that this woman is actually a respectable woman and not a prostitute? Because there were a lot of prostitutes in Greek society. So some indicators of her actual status can be seen in the presence of her husband, for example. The fact that she can afford to purchase the shoes that she's purchasing from a craftsman. There's also her pale skin. Notice how pale her skin is in comparison with the men. This is an indication that she's not outside often. She is not one of the lower class women who has to work outside of the home. And we can even look at the fact that she's elevated on the table as an indicator of her social status as well. So the Golden Age of Athens was well known for its innovation, and so we're going to talk about some of those innovations. First, we're going to talk about education. New forms of education emerged in the 5th century B.C.E. Sons were tutored at home in reading, music, and athletic skills that Greeks believed were suitable for war. So participating in athletics was training for possibly having to serve as a soldier or in the Navy. Service in militia and exercise in public gymnasia were actually part of the daily lives of men. Daughters in wealthy families also received instruction at home in reading, writing, and arithmetic because these skills were needed for managing a household. The poor received no formal education, but they were sometimes trained in a trade. Young men were often mentored in public life by an older man in relationships that were sometimes sexual. As democracy became more radical, persuasive speech became a highly valued skill, and some young men paid professional teachers or sophists to instruct them in the new skills of persuasion. Remember, one of the reasons why Pericles was so successful is that he had a real talent for persuasion. These sophists offered new ideas about the cosmos, and they challenged traditional philosophical and religious beliefs. They actually competed for students and appealed to the ambitions of their students. Protagoras and other sophists argued that truth and custom were both subjective. Many sophists, including Protagoras, were also agnostic, which offended many religious traditionalists. Other philosophers of the era proposed new theories about the nature of the cosmos that worried many and discredited traditional understandings of the gods. Because only wealthy men could afford their training, the sophists threatened Athenian democracy by giving yet another advantage to the rich in the assembly's debates or speeches in court. In the 430s, a law was passed allowing for charges for impiety, and this is important. It's important, and we're going to see why. Now, something to think about is that one of the ways that sophists one of the methods that they used for coming to conclusions was that they would often argue a point just to disprove it. And even if it were considered truth or a fact, they would argue points in such a way to bring an individual around to believing that something wasn't true. And so if you're a traditionalist and you're running into these sophists, many of these traditionalists, those who were dedicated to Greek religion and saw it as integral to Greek's stability and prosperity, then it was very, very uncomfortable, and it came to be seen as a threat. And so we see this new crime of impiety coming up as a way of dealing with that. People are worried that these new philosophies and these new ways of looking at the world are going to cause the gods to become angry and are going to cause decline, war, instability, famine, disaster, what have you. All of these things that are seen as an indication that the gods are unhappy. Now, in your primary readings, you're going to read about Socrates. Socrates, who was a philosopher, he taught that virtue and happiness came through a life of just behavior rather than through wealth or public success. So he believed that if you acted justly, that was a good thing. He was the most famous philosopher of the Golden Age. But interestingly, we don't have any of his surviving works. He didn't write anything down. He taught by word of mouth. In fact, he would often, his method was to walk out in the open air and attract students to him, and then he would ask a series of questions. And the idea behind this is that as he's asking these students questions, he's kind of guiding them to come to a conclusion. And so he didn't necessarily tell people what to believe, but he guided them by asking questions to arrive at knowledge. And this was called the Socratic method. And so the way to think about this is that he led people to draw conclusions in response to his probing questions and refutations of their cherished assumptions. So he liked to question their assumptions, to lead them to question their assumptions, and come to what he would have felt was more reasoned and logical conclusions. And interestingly enough, he was not agnostic. He believed in the gods. But this process became known as the Socratic method, and it is still a method that you will see today in classrooms. It's a very popular method, and it's actually one that I rather like in terms of being able to when I'm in the classroom. It's a method that I like to use to invite discussions and to encourage students to think about things in a very analytical way. Now, Socrates used reasoning to discover universal objective standards for people to live by, and his ideas were disturbing to many because they rejected traditional Athenian beliefs and values. And so even though he was not an agnostic, people were concerned about it. And because he used questioning, sometimes he got linked to Sophists, and this is going to be a problem. Herodotus and Thucydides invented history writing that actually took a critical view of the past and based accounts on reliable evidence and critical thinking. And so we consider Herodotus and Thucydides to be the first real significant historians. They weren't merely recording, they were actually thinking critically about the events that they were writing about. Herodotus explained the Persian Wars as a clash between Eastern and Western culture, for example. He used an in-depth and investigative approach to evidence. He saw Greeks and non-Greeks as equally capable of good and evil. Human psychology, rather than the gods, were the driving force of history for Herodotus. Thucydides competed with Herodotus. His history of the Peloponnesian War focused on power politics as history's primary force. His narrative vividly and frankly described human failings, including those of Athenians. Moving on to Hippocrates. Hippocrates lived in the 5th century B.C.E. This is probably a familiar name to you if you've ever heard of the Hippocratic Oath in medicine. But he challenged traditional practices by grounding medical diagnosis and treatment in clinical observation. He insisted that physical factors caused disease and thought that maintaining health required keeping the humors that made up the human body in balance. And you can read more about that in the primary sources. Now, this is a great statue of Socrates, and you can see that it's not very idealized. We've seen a lot of Greek in your book. You'll see a lot of statues of Greek work that are very idealized, idealizations of the human body. But Socrates, this statue of Socrates, was not one of them. But when you look at this, how is a statue in keeping with Athenian ideals, or does it present a challenge to them? Now, Socrates questioned all of society's mores, and he believed that physical appearance was less important than the soul, as opposed to the Athenian ideas that privileged the outward body, these physical ideals of the human body. And emphasized a sound mind in a sound body and this achievement of physical perfection. Even so, this statuette is in a similar style to other pieces of this time, so it's not entirely divorced from the society in which it was created, much like Socrates. And so it's kind of symbolic of the role that Socrates played in Athenian society. So given that we don't know what Socrates actually looked like, we have to think about how much stock we can actually put in such images of him. Such images are important regardless of their accuracy because they could look like him. They certainly resemble his descriptions of himself with a large stomach and a cheap cloak. Or they could represent how contemporary society wished to portray him, which is equally interesting and revealing. Now, tragic dramas were Athens' most prominent cultural innovation. Tragedies involved shocking stories and fierce conflicts. They frequently involved myths and powerful forces, and these all related to issues in contemporary Athens. In fact, we can read these tragedies and get some indication of what was going on in the hearts and minds of Athenians. They were performed at the festival of Dionysus, and tragedies were competitive art that were subsidized by tax revenues, and so these were actually competitions where these tragedies would be presented, and you would have a winner at the end. Officials selected 3 competitors who presented a series of plays over 3 days. And so if you wanted to compete in this, you would submit your piece and hope that you got selected. Tragic performances took place during the day in front of an audience of some 14,000 was often the norm. 18 male characters played all roles and performed song and dance as a chorus. Tragedy featured elaborate costumes and masks and depended on actors with powerful voices because dialogue was at the heart of the performance. Performances also featured special effects. Writers, usually from the elite, also served as directors, producers, and actors. And so, in order to get a sense of how important theater became to the Greeks, you can see some sites of the most important theaters around the Greek world, and so you can see there were quite a number of them, and they were very attractive to Greeks. It was a popular activity. Like tragedies, similar to tragedies, Greek comedies were also written in verse, and they were performed for competition at Dionysus festivals as well, and they were also subsidized by state funds. Comedies, however, commented directly on contemporary events, with plots that offered outrageous fantasies of public life. And there's a great example of one of these comedies in your sources book. It's a really terrific example of comedy and how it could sort of turn society on its head to question itself and mock itself. Unlike tragedies, comedies used jokes and puns, and they mocked public figures, particularly political figures. They were commenting directly on public policy and criticizing current politicians and intellectuals. Everything was fair game. Pericles, in fact, was often criticized for his policies and for his love life. The tradition of free speech protected comedians from lawsuits or other reprisals, and so these could be quite rambunctious plays. Women were often main characters and powerful figures in the comedies of Aristophanes, for example. And like I said, there's a great example of a play, Lysistratus, by Aristophanes, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Athenian comedy offered an important forum for free speech and energetic public criticism in Athenian society, and I think you can see that tradition continuing today in the United States and much of the Western world. It's a very old tradition. So let's start talking about the decline of Athens' golden age. War between Athens and Sparta ended the Athenian golden age. Athenian aggression against Spartan allies Corinth and Megara brought an end to a 446 B.C.E. treaty between the two city-states. So as Athens is becoming more aggressive to some of Sparta's allies, Sparta, as a result of its alliances, is feeling the need to step in and put a stop to Athenian aggression, and this does not end well. When Sparta demanded that Athens ease restrictions on its allies, the Athenian assembly, under the leadership of Pericles, actually refused to compromise. In 431, Sparta invaded Athenian territory to curb the power of the Delian League. Pericles urged Athenians to attack Spartan territory by sea. He felt that land battles were unwinnable against Sparta because Sparta had a superior infantry, so he really felt that the key was to fight this war by sea. So he believed this so strongly that even when the Spartan hoplites plundered the Athenian countryside outside the city, he continued to pursue this naval strategy, this emphasis on a naval war. He believed Athens could actually win a war of attrition, meaning that if they could just hold out, remember that map, that site plan that showed the long wall between the harbor and this actual city of Athens. He believed that because of this sort of defensive structures around Athens and its ties to the sea, that they could actually just wait it out. They could emphasize a naval war, and they could just wait for Sparta to give up, because he believed that Spartans couldn't win if Athens used that strategy. So he just really felt that Sparta couldn't support a long invasion and occupation of Athenian territory. As the Athenians hid behind the city's long walls, a plague struck in 430 BCE, and this ravaged the population. It actually killed Pericles. It was really devastating, and it wasn't something that Pericles and the city's leaders had anticipated. The generals elected after Pericles' death pursued a more aggressive strategy. Athenian counterattacks led by a man named Cleon were successful until the Spartan general Brasidas took control of Athens' possessions in northern Greece, and as a result of this, it crippled the Athenian supply of timber and precious metals from this region. Following the deaths of both Brasidas and Cleon in 422 BCE, mutual exhaustion led Sparta and Athens to make peace in 421 BCE. However, in 418, the Athenian general Alcibiades led a successful attack on the Spartan ally Milos. In 415, an expensive Athenian expedition against Sparta's allies in Sicily led to catastrophe. Sparta established a base in Athenian territory in 413 and devastated the Athenian countryside. Persia then allied with Sparta, and with the help of a Persian-built fleet, Athens was forced to surrender in 404 BCE after 27 years of war. This was really devastating to Athens and to the Greek world in general. So this gives you some sense of the scope and scale of the Peloponnesian War, which was a long, protracted war involving a lot of territory, and we can see from the map that Persia gets involved, and the war even extends clear over into Sicily, which is at the base of the boot, at the toe of the Italian boot. And so, this involved the entire Greek world and some of its neighbors, and it just really devastated the region. The Greek city-states were so integral to Mediterranean trade that even if you as a people weren't involved in this war, you were probably affected by it if you were involved in Mediterranean trade at all. Now, following Athens' surrender to Sparta, the Spartans installed a regime of anti-democratic Athenians who were willing to collaborate with the victors. They were willing to collaborate with the Spartans. They were known as the 30 Tyrants. These men brutally repressed any democratic opposition. The competing ambitions of its members actually weakened the tyrants, however, and after 8 months of murder and plunder, really rampant murder and plunder, a rebellion by other Athenians defeated them and restored democracy. The new democratic government declared the first amnesty in Western history. They forbid charges or recriminations for the crimes of the 30 tyrants. However, after nearly 30 years of war, Athens' military and political strength was shattered. And one of the consequences of the Peloponnesian War, followed by the rule of the 30 tyrants, is that it left Greeks feeling like their political system and their social system was a little bit tenuous. And so following the reign of the 30 tyrants, we're going to talk about this more next week, there's going to be a period of scapegoating. They're going to look for someone to blame. So because they never got to kind of deal with the 30 tyrants themselves because they were given amnesty, oftentimes the repercussions of this is that other people suffered as a result, and we're going to see that Socrates gets caught up in this, that he becomes one of the victims of this uncertainty that characterized Athenian society following the rule of the 30 tyrants. It was a really difficult time to be a Greek. So I like to end lectures by kind of talking about how the world has changed following the period that we're studying for that week. So this is just a map of the Mediterranean world and gives you a sense of the broader area that we know today of as Europe, with of course the inset map showing classical Greece at the time. And so you can if you want to pause the map and just take a look at it and get a feel for different groups and where they're situated. A lot of these groups we're going to be learning about in subsequent weeks. And this is just another map of classical Greece. You saw it in that little inset, and it just gives you a close-up view. And so you're welcome to pause this and just kind of study it a little bit and get some understanding of where some of these places are situated that we've been talking about in this chapter.